Alien came asking my name. The promise at Port Havel. When they pulled me out of the freighter's twisted belly, the first thing I noticed was how quiet my hands felt, like they had been emptied of something that belonged to me. The salvage crew called me reckless, the traders called me lucky, and the old archivist on Station Esham called me a promise keeper, the way a child calls a stray dog by its name. I used to accept those labels as if they were currency. I learned in time that names and promises are a different kind of currency. They buy and sell parts of the past. This story begins with a name. She walked into Port Havel on a morning that smelled of diesel and salt. The market stuttered. Vendors paused mid-argue over the price of canned kelp. She wore a patched salvage suit that had been mended so many times, the fabric told the tale of repair like a map. There were no council insignias on her shoulders, no rank plates, only a small, faded strip of cloth stitched inside with a single name in a language I had never seen before, Miral. She asked for me by my given name without preface, and when she said it, the sound felt like a rope thrown from another life. Bilal Kadir. I had been called worse at worse times. Thief, coward, hero, liar. But a voice calling my name from someone who looked like no one I had met before made silence sit heavy in my chest. Around us, a dozen conversations continued. People glanced and went back to bargaining. Only the dockmaster kept watching like a man tracking an animal that might bite. "Why do you want me?" I asked. My hands were steady because they had to be. "Salvage is a job that does not let you falter." She did not answer right away. She watched the freighter we had just taken from the sea, a wreck jammed into the shallow reef, half of its hull eaten by rust and pressure. "Because you once kept what others would have sold," she said at last. "Because you kept the child's voice." A dozen colors of memory stitched together and left an ache behind my ribs. Years ago, on an abandoned research platform, I had found a small recorder hidden beneath a child's cot. No value to the traders, useless to collectors, but full of a voice. The voice told trivial things. How the wind tasted on their moon, the names of constellations as children learned them, a lullaby so crooked and beautiful it made my chest ache. The old archivist called that recording part of the last archive of Esham and begged me to keep it safe enough to someday return. I had promised. Then I had sold other promises for coin and comfort. I had not sold that one. Miral placed a cracked hollow slate on the counter and turned it toward me. Light pooled from its center, and in that light my name looked small and ordinary and not nearly heavy enough. Beside my name in the list of entries was a looping glyph, a mark the Orignal, she would later tell me, used to indicate belonging. "My sister learned your promise from that recording," she said. "She died before we could finish the map. I came to finish it." "Finish it?" I echoed. The word felt cheap and dangerous. "Recover the archive," she said. "Bring back the stories that were burned." Her voice was exact and quiet. Not the sort of panic that demands immediate action. Not the sort of pleading that beggars sentiment. A sentence like that is a kind of time bomb for someone who owes the world a kindness. Either you go and you try, or you admit you let an entire people lose their memory because you could not be bothered. I told myself I had reasons. My ledger had many pages. There were repairs to be paid, a small ship to maintain, a daughter I had not seen in 3 years because I could not afford the passage. Those are good reasons to keep promises only when the promises are bills and contracts. They are poor reasons when the promise is a person's song. "I will help," I said. I surprised myself by saying it. She smiled like a tide coming in slow and inevitable. "We leave tonight," she said. We left with 2 small backpacks and the recorder tucked close to my ribs. Miral wore a band of woven metal around her forearm that hummed when the ship's engines kicked like it was counting the minutes until something happened. She told me her people's name in fragments at first. Orignal, a folk that had once threaded the space between comets with little wooden ships and songs. They were not conquerors or colonists. They were keepers of small, precise rituals and gentle engineering. Their villages had been burned in the War of Silence by a faction that believed certain stories made people dangerous. They had scattered, and the archive fragmented. Over the next 3 months, we moved like a rumor. We traded favors with harbor lords who owed us drinks, bribed a disgraced corporate librarian to let us copy a microfilament, and cut a less than honorable deal with a smuggler who recognized the value of a child's lullaby. We became archaeologists of the small and the living, a shard of manuscript here, a voice print buried in a derelict comms array there, a bone with a single line of verse carved into it in a back alley where an old poet had once mumbled to the gutters. Each find felt like a stitch in a ragged quilt. Each stitch was tiny and fragile. Each stitch hummed with the possibility that a life could be remembered. There were nights the work nearly undid me. Corporate security is slow but patient. They have archives of their own and a habit of not sleeping when it comes to property that might embarrass their founders. We narrowly escaped a retrieval team once, diving through the guts of a hospital ship while alarms thudded above like crows. On another occasion, a poet's granddaughter wept when she handed us an audio spool that contained a fragment of a lullaby, because every time she sang it, she forgot a face and then remembered a memory, and then someone died again. Morale never stopped cataloging. She had a habit of reverent efficiency. A scrap of song would pulse through the recorder and her fingers would move like a librarian's, tagging the waveforms with names that were not written anywhere else. She spoke to the recorder as if it were a living thing. "This is from the North Village," she'd say, tracing a symbol into the thin air. "This is from the lighthouse keeper who grew walnuts and told the children about the starfish." She remembered things exactly as the recordings wanted to be remembered. One evening, we found the core. It looked like nothing at first, a crate stuffed in the belly of a banker's yacht that had been scuttled to hide a debt. The crate was heavy with the stink of old paper and lemon oil. Inside, there was a lattice of microfilaments coiled like a sleeping animal and a voice print engine the size of a fist. When I touched the engine, it hummed, and a dozen faint recorded voices rose up, crossing and overlapping like a chorus warming itself. The recorder I had kept recognized one voice and began to play. It was a child's voice, cracked by age but uncrushed, and for a moment the ship felt full of small hands and a dusk that belonged to a different moon. We should have celebrated. Instead, an alarm latched onto us like a tooth. Corporate retrieval units had logged the yacht in their spreadsheets. They assumed the archive was a curiosity and moved to secure it. We had minutes. We left with what we could haul, the lattice and the engine and a bone with a single poem carved along its length. We left 100 pieces behind that night. We left with regret and a song stitched to the inside of my jacket pocket. Port Havel did not have the infrastructure for proper restoration. But songs travel faster than bureaucracy when given a simple transmitter and someone willing to press the button. Miral set up a small broadcast using a market stall's old transmitter. Then we sat and listened as the lattice unspooled voices into the evening. It is a strange thing to listen to a culture remembering itself. Words that had been only fragments found their cadence. Names folded into sentences like hands finding other hands. People gathered in the market, humans, traders, scavengers, even a few who had once called the Aryan monsters. They listened. Then something else happened that I had not expected. A dozen small ships rose from beyond the settlement, like a school of fish lifting together, and the harbor filled with people who stepped down with boxes of food, with lists of names, with maps drawn in the margins of books. They did not come to trade. They came to rebuild. That is what HFY looks like when it forgets the chest thumping. It looks like communities reshaping themselves to give back what was taken. Humans in Port Havel offered storage, a dry place to keep the lattice, help with copying files, and a dozen modest hands. Traders offered jobs translating the pause between words. Children learned a lullaby that was not theirs, and in learning it, they learned the space where empathy lives. We rebuilt a small archive in a corner of the market. It was not elegant. It was racks and tarps and a generator that coughed like an old man, but it was honest. People came with more fragments. A retired pilot handed over a wrist slate that contained minutes of a village council. A teacher offered a child's drawing that, when scanned, revealed a map. It was messy. It was human. And it worked. Then the past tried to burn again. A corporate lawyer showed up with a clipboard and a voice like a cold window. He insisted the materials were stolen property and wanted them returned to corporate custody. He had lawyers, and he had a mandate. We had a market, a lattice, and a handful of friends. The lawyer wanted power. Miral wanted memory. I wanted a clean conscience. We bargained. The lawyer offered to keep the archive safe, behind permit forms and legalese that would have drained the life from the collection. Miral rejected the terms with a quiet disappointment only someone who had lived through cultural erasure could muster. "If they put this behind glass and law," she said, "it will be the same as if it never existed." I had a choice. I could sign away the lattice for a sum that would pay for my ship and a berth in a decent port where my daughter might come visit. I could put the archive into a vault and sleep easier. Or I could stand with a patched suit alien who had come asking for a promise I had once made. I thought of the old archivist's face when she held the recorder the last night of her life. Wrinkled, pleased, small, and content because something would survive her. I thought of the child's voice and the way a lullaby had once made my chest ache. I thought of small decisions building into the shape of a man. "We keep it here," I said. The lawyer wrote notes and added threats. Corporate men have patience for paperwork and not for song. They filed claims. They showed up with more men. The market resisted. Not with weapons, at least not at first. We resisted with stubbornness, with petitions, with a sudden civic refusal to let a people's memory be scooped into a legal bin. People who had once sold favors for spice gave spare credits. Children carried copies of songs in their pockets like contraband. A small courthouse hearing turned into a neighborhood demonstration, then into a hearing with witnesses, then into a televised debate that I had not expected to enjoy. The counsel eventually relented. The lawyer went back to his office with a record of the day's proceedings and the comforting belief that justice had been served in the right language. The archive stayed in Port Havel under a community stewardship agreement. Thin, legal, flawed, but it worked. We had not beaten power with violence. We had beaten it with a network of small decisions and a people's willingness to claim what was theirs. Morale stayed through the winter. She taught children songs and watched the archive grow thicker with the polite, stubborn insistence of those who refused to let memory die. She translated things that had been recorded in ways that matched the modern dialects of the ports. She taught me to count in her number system and, in the late nights, to listen to the edges of lullabies. She laughed easier than anyone I had known, and we fought once over a stolen radio part and made up by sharing a bowl of kelp stew. When she finally prepared to leave, a flotilla of little ships came to take her home. They were not grand. They were full of people who had been busy living for a while. They had maps and recipes and friends they had found through the broadcast. They had a plan to reweave their small communities and a permission to do so that would not be stamped by corporate hands. Before she left, she pressed the cracked hollow into my palm. "For when you forget," she said simply. I keep it on a shelf by the corridor. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I press play. A child's voice sings a crooked lullaby, and for a moment I am back on that frost-silver moon, feeling less alone than I usually am. The market still smells of diesel and salt. My ship still needs repairs. My daughter still lives far away. But I learned that promises are not paper. They are actions, and they become the floorboards of a life. People ask me sometimes who saved whom. I always say the same thing. Miral and her people saved their songs. Port Havel and its stubborn hacks saved those songs from being locked in a vault. I saved nothing heroic. I did, however, keep a promise that once existed on a dying woman's breath, and by so doing I found that small human thing, belonging. If you ever find someone in a market asking for your name, listen. You might think it is a threat or a convenience or a scam, or it might be the soft skein of a dangling promise someone once made and forgot. Promises are strange currencies. They do not buy ships or spice. They buy the right to be remembered, and being remembered is everything.